Adventures Through the Mind is an interview-based podcast hosted by me, James W. Jesso. Here on the show, we take an interdisciplinary approach to the vast nuances and outer reaches of the psychedelic experience and of psychedelic culture. However, none of the explicitly drug-oriented content is meant to glorify or promote the use of drugs in any way. It is in the values of harm reduction that this show seeks to educate and explore the important insights related to psychedelic research while encouraging responsible, safe, and informed decisions. Also, this podcast is a part of a larger body of work that is my artistic and educational investment in being a writer and a speaker. It is fully fan-funded and would not be possible without listeners like you. So big thanks to those leaving one-time PayPal or crypto donations, as well as my patrons on Patreon for your generosity and support, especially those whose names are listed in the show notes to this episode. For those of you who have yet to become a supporter of the show, but are really liking it so far, I kindly invite you to offer whatever you can to the process of creating it by becoming my patron on Patreon or by leaving a one-time donation. Details can be found in the written description to this episode or at jamesandbjesso.com/support. Thank you. Enjoy the show. Today's interview is with Rick Hanson, a neuroplasticity specialist. Rick Hanson, Ph.D., is a psychologist, senior fellow of the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley, and New York Times bestselling author. His books are available in 26 languages and include Hardwiring Happiness, Buddha's Brain, Just One Thing, and Mother Nature. He edits the Wise Brain Bulletin and has numerous audio programs. A summa cum laude graduate of UCLA and the founder of the Wellspring Institute for Neuroscience and Contemplative Wisdom, he's been an invited speaker at NASA, Oxford, Stanford, Harvard, and other major universities, and taught in meditation centers worldwide. His work has been featured on the BBC, CBS, and NPR, and he offers the free Just One Thing newsletter with over 120,000 subscribers, plus the online Foundations of Wellbeing program in positive neuroplasticity that anyone with financial need can do for free. That is the man we have on the show today to discuss basically neuroplasticity in general, but then in specific to what neuroplasticity or what role neuroplasticity plays in emotional learning and how we can take advantage of that potential our brain has for changing itself and utilize it towards whatever direction we choose consciously. For example, in this interview, we talk about the cultivation of happiness, resilience, and even spiritual awareness, specifically mindfulness, but we get into a pretty deep discussion about the nature of being and what might happen to the brain and what are we reinforcing when we sit on, to use Rick's words, the front edge of now within our meditation practices. I feel very good about this interview with Rick. Unfortunately, the time frame that he had available for the interview was fairly short, and we did even go over, but it's unfortunate because, wow, some juicy stuff started to come up at the end there, and a bit sad to have to end the conversation in the midst of such a thick and delicious discussion, but he has agreed to potentially open up the idea of talking again on the show in a few months' time, so here's a fingers crossed for that. Before we get into the interview, I just want to give another shout out to my patrons on Patreon and to the people who are leaving one-time donations, especially the people whose names are in the upper corner of the screen here on YouTube or written in the description to this episode, as well as a big thank you for the generous donation to Patrick. Thank you very, very much, Patrick. Further PayPal donation thank yous go to Thomas, Mel, Al, and Michael. And to everyone else who has been sharing the recent episodes and telling your friends about it, I can see that the numbers are growing and how many people are listening. And I am very, very grateful for your support of the show on all levels, financially and socially. One last thing very quickly is that I will be going to Europe this summer, and I'm very, very excited about it. And if you would like to support my project of heading to Europe, which will include picking up several different technology supplies so I can be doing interviews for the podcast on location at various festivals and other conferences that I will be at. You can obviously become a patron on Patreon, but you could do other things. Like, for example, I just released a new talk called Healing the Past, which you can listen to for free or drop me a donation in thanks for it. You could also buy a copy of one of my books, Decomposing the Shadow or The True Light of Darkness. Whatever kind of support you offer goes a long way. I'm very excited about this project of getting on location interviews. And yeah, I think it's going to be great. So thank you so much for helping support me in supporting this show to achieve this very interesting and I think delicious opportunity to get real deep, really in person with several excellent thinkers from around the world. Of course, all links to support are in the description, including links to my book and to the talk that I just mentioned. So thank you very much for allowing me that short moment to self-promote what I am doing outside of the podcast. Please enjoy this episode with Dr. Rick Hanson. Welcome, Rick, to the show.
James, I'm glad to be here.
Let's get right into it. A central topic of this podcast here is our capacity to change our minds, not just superficially, but fundamentally, often focusing on psychedelics as the agents of such change. This type of change is not just an ethereal alteration of mental processes, but an actual redesigning of neural architecture. Our capacity to create such fundamental changes is due to our brain's capacity to redesign its structure, lay new synaptic connections, which is called neuroplasticity. The literature on neuroplasticity is not only well established as being the means by which our brains changed, but neuroplasticity itself is an essential ingredient in learning, not just facts and ideas, but ways of living, but even the very essence of our sense of self and how we see the world. So, maybe to start us off, you can expand or correct on what I just said here about neuroplasticity, as well as how emotional learning and thus brain structure influence our sense of self, perception of the world, and our emotional tendencies.
Well, James, for starters, that was arguably the best, or at least tied for first place, cogent summary I've ever encountered in this kind of environment of neuroplasticity. Probably any kind of environment. So I really want to tip my hat to you.
Thank you.
That was a very clear statement that you really got. And I think it will be a service to people because it was so clear. Maybe a little discussion of the hardware to go under the hood, as it were. So right now, whether people are listening or viewing, reflect on the fact that inside your own brain are over 1 trillion cells. About 1.1 trillion cells. And 10% of them, merely, quote unquote, 100 billion or so, are neurons. We have as many neurons inside our head as there are stars in the Milky Way galaxy. The brain, of course, is embedded in a larger network of the nervous system, which is embedded in even larger networks of the body, which is embedded in even larger networks of biology, nature, life, and culture, and then edging out into material reality. And as both a scientifically minded person and a Buddhistly minded person, I find it quite extraordinary at a personal psychological level to reflect on the ways in which we are each local patternings of a vast and larger reality. Wow. Okay, so inside the head, we have these 100 billion or so neurons that are supported by the other cells, the glial cells, the other trillion or so, but I won't talk too much about them, because where information processing mainly happens is with neural activity. And underlying information processing is the basis for our experiences, what it's like to be me, moment by moment by moment, whether we're straight or whether we're tripping. Mm-hmm. So just to finish up on the hardware, a typical neuron makes several thousand connections with other neurons, giving us several hundred trillion connections called synapses, each one of which is like a little microprocessor. And there are other bases for information processing elsewhere in the connections between neurons and in neurons themselves, but synapses are really basic. So just think about that for a moment. Several hundred trillion microprocessors all sparkling away, all doing different things right now as the organ that we're talking about is trying to figure out the organ that we're talking about. As all that neural activity occurs, a typical neuron is firing 5 to 50 times a second. New connections are forming between neurons. Unused connections are withering away. Existing connections become stronger or weaker based on neural activity. There are ebbs and flows of neurotransmitter molecules, neurochemicals of various kinds based on our experiences and the underlying neural activity that is the basis for our experiences. There are also, just to finish here, changes in epigenetics and gene expression based upon our experiences and the learning we have from our experiences. Mm-hmm. So the takeaway point here is kind of summarized in the saying from the Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb: neurons that fire together, wire together. So repeated patterns of experience, which entail repeated patterns of neural activity, leave lasting traces behind in enduring changes in neural structure and function. In other words, our experiences are continually changing us for better or worse. And so when I think about entheogens or psychedelics, or I think more generally about interventions, deliberate or accidental, in the nervous system, I could think of two kinds of distinct pathways that are meaningful here. One pathway is the ways in which physiological activity of various kinds, including the introduction of substances ranging from caffeine and alcohol to marijuana and LSD, those substances can alter the plasticity of the nervous system. In other words, they can alter the degree to which key regions in the brain are susceptible to change due to the experiences that an individual is having. The second distinct pathway for me is through the mind, not through physiology or through matter. And through the mind, what I mean by that is simply in an ordinary sense, the experiences that we're having, by having particular kinds of experiences that necessarily involves the stimulation of particular kinds of neural activity and particular kinds of neural regions, and which means that you can deliberately activate the substrates of certain experiences, and by stimulating them, you can strengthen them. So you can literally build up inner peace, love, happiness, grit, gratitude, confidence through stimulating the neural substrates of those psychological resources or ways of being. And more broadly and remarkably, you can stimulate the capacity for cosmic consciousness or stimulate the capacity for penetrating insight into the radical transience of every instant of phenomenology by repeatedly having that sort of an experience and helping it change your brain in a positive way. It's also true to truly finish, that certain kinds of experiences, notably playfulness and delight, can also increase neuroplastic factors such as brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. Playfulness and other kinds of enthusiastic, positive emotion tend to stimulate the activity of these particular chemicals, which in turn increase the plasticity of the nervous system and its responsiveness to our experiences. All right, that was a lot.
That was good. That was good. Thanks for nailing it so well. Now, the idea of certain types of experiences cultivating, we'll say, the strengthening, I know this isn't the best metaphor, but strengthening, say, the happiness muscle, or strengthening the self-loathing muscle. Like the experience is the exercise. I think I remember a saying, either I wrote it or I heard somebody else write it, something along the lines of, whenever you're doing something, you're training your brain to be better at doing that thing. including patterns of perception and self-perception.
Yeah.
And it's also fairly well established that the biology, the neurobiology and the psychology of a person optimizes to integrating and remembering negative things a lot easier than positive things as an extension of our evolution of needing to be able to know 100% for sure if we encountered something dangerous that we'll be ready and not encounter it again and be killed, basically. So we have this capacity to really take on negative experiences, and it actually is quite difficult to bring on positive experiences. There's this disparity here. Now, I believe that this is called the negativity bias. And I got a little note here. You call what you call the process that you present in, say, practicing happier states of mind as positive neuroplasticity, and claim it to work against negativity bias. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit?
Okay. So as usual, incredibly cogent, great summary, and then several deep questions packed together. So I'll try to, unpack them a bit here. And again, James, wow, you really got it. I mean, you're nailing it. Mm-hmm. So let's see here. First point, it's totally true. You said repeated experiences tend to shift us. We tend to move from states to traits. And as traits develop, as people develop greater, let's say, trait happiness, or on the other hand, they develop greater trait pessimism or feelings of inadequacy or incapability, those changes in trait tend to foster changes of state. Greater trait happiness inclines us toward having more happy experiences, more states of happiness, and greater trait, let's say, depression, inclines a person toward more states of blue mood, sadness, and hopelessness, and despair. All right. So that's really true. Mm-hmm. Second, the brain exactly has a bias toward, with regard to learning from negative experiences. And there's a couple of key points here. So first of all, people tend to have a quantity effect for positive experiences, most people. And obviously there are many people that this doesn't fit for, both people in terrible situations like refugees in a war zone, or people living in grinding poverty day to day, or people who themselves are, let's say, deeply depressed, in a way that's meaningfully distinct from their environment. Okay. But other than those people, research shows.
Wait, quantity effect? I didn't understand that term before you move on.
Most people, most ordinary people, quote unquote, have predominantly positive or neutral moments in the course of the day. So if you ping people in a study randomly and you ask them sort of like, green, yellow, or red, as it were, or green, gray, or red, more exactly, what are you experiencing right now? Most of the time people will respond, green or gray. Mm-hmm. Positive or neutral. Little moment.
Except for people who have suffered some sort of intense trauma, or people going through...
People who are in a horrible situation, in a really tough situation, including just, let's say, in a relationship or a family in which, or a school where they're being picked on all the time, or assaulted or abused. I mean, it's true. Mm-hmm. But generally, people tend to have predominantly neutral or, emotionally positive moments, typically mild emotionally positive moments, but genuine. So there's a quantity effect for positive experiences.
Got it.
The problem is there's a quality effect for negative experiences. We overlearn from them. And there's much research that shows that one negative interaction with another person affects the relationship much more than multiple positive interactions with the same person. A moment, an experience of helplessness lands on us harder than many counter experiences of agency or efficacy, being a hammer instead of a nail. We remember negative information about other people, malicious gossip, better than we remember the nice thing about them. Thus, the fascination with celebrity scandals or negative attack ads in politics. Mm-hmm. So, and the reason for this, so that's the way it is. The brain is designed to do 5 things in terms of the negativity bias. Scan for bad news. We're vigilant for bad news out in the world, in our relationships, and in our own bodies and minds. Tend to scan for bad news. And by the way, these tendencies have natural variation among individuals. So people sort of temperamentally come out of the box. The joke is if you are a parent of 1 child, you believe in nurture, but if you are a parent of 2 children, you believe in nature because you recognize your kids have such different temperaments. So there are normal temperamental variations in terms of the negativity bias. And people learn to become more biased toward the negative, or over time, this is where we're going, more biased toward the positive. And I'll get to that in a moment. So routinely, the brain does 5 things by design. It's Mother Nature's plan to keep her little babies alive to see the sunrise and pass on genes that pass on genes. First, we scan for bad news. Second, we overfocus upon it. Third, we overreact to it. Fourth, it's fast-tracked into memory, especially emotional memory, somatic memory. And then fifth, the experiences of stressful, negative moments, including anxiety, irritation, frustration, self-doubt, hurt, and so forth, gradually sensitize the brain even further to the negative. They make it even more negative. So as I summarize it, we've got a brain that's like Velcro for the bad, but Teflon for the good by design. And with negative experiences, it becomes even more Velcro-y for the bad and Teflon-y for the good. That's by design. That's because that worked in evolution to help our ancestors, fulfill rule 1 in the wild: eat lunch today, don't be lunch today.
Right.
Yeah. So that's the background. And then what's the takeaway? Well, for me, the takeaway is twofold. First, independent of whatever might be true about the negativity bias, just for general purposes, we need to develop psychological resources inside. Insight, happiness, grit, gratitude, self-worth, secure attachment, executive functions, skills with other people, skills with our own mind. These are the muscles, including the happiness muscle, that enable us to cope with life, to be resilient, to experience well-being, and to have things inside ourselves that we can offer to other people. So just in its own right, it's good to develop psychological resources. Research shows roughly 2/3 of our psychological resources are acquired rather than innate. In other words, they're learned, they're acquired. How can we acquire them? We acquire them necessarily, and this is an incredibly important point here, the necessary process of acquiring any good qualities inside yourself, including healing from your past, or greater skillfulness in the present, or more realistic outlook for the future. That process has 2 necessary and sufficient steps, but you need both of them. The first step is we have to experience what we want to grow inside. We have to experience mindfulness to develop greater trait mindfulness. We have to start with experiences. Second, we must internalize those experiences in some way as to create a lasting change in the brain. Otherwise, it might have been momentarily ecstatic, woohoo, but we didn't become a happier person as a result, or wiser, or more loving, or more resilient. So that process is the process of positive neuroplasticity, the process of positive brain change. And that's a general term. I didn't coin it. It's in common usage. It's a strong term that's accepted now. And what it means realistically is that if people want to help themselves be a little wiser, a little more loving, a little happier, a little calmer, a little stronger when they go to bed than when they woke up in the morning, which is really the power that we have to change our lives for the better over time. If people care about that, the way to do it is very straightforward and simple. Have beneficial experiences, useful, usually enjoyable experiences. And then second, as you're having them, help them change your brain in lasting ways. Help them be consolidated. Experiencing alone does not equal learning. People routinely skip that second step. And we'll talk about how to do that, I'm sure, in a moment. But the essence is really simple. Stay with the experience for a breath or two or three. The longer those neurons are firing together, the more they'll wire together. Feel it in your body as much as possible, including exotic or esoteric experiences. Try to have a sense of it in the body as much as possible. And third, focus on what's rewarding about it, what's enjoyable or meaningful or both about it, which will, and all three of these factors, duration of the experience, embodiment of the experience, and the reward value of the experience, all increase neuroplastic change. And they increase the tendency of the experience to become consolidated as a lasting change over several hours and even days, as a lasting change in the flesh, in the actual body. So for that reason alone, it's worth doing positive neuroplasticity.
Right, definitely.
Duh. Also, when you really get that the brain sucks at the process of positive internalization, it's not very good at it. It's not very efficient at it compared to how good it is at immediately internalizing experiences of worry or irritation or hurt or sadness or anger. The brain's really good at that. When you get, wow, my brain is really like a super slow learner. It's tilted away from gaining the good from the experiences I'm having, and it's really good at sucking in the bad into me. Whoa, I need to tilt toward the positive. I need to tilt toward looking realistically for authentically good facts out in the world and in myself. And then when I find them, I need to tilt toward helping myself feel them. And when I feel them, I need to tilt, in other words, I'm experiencing them, I need to tilt toward taking them in. When I tilt in that way, I simply level the playing field in terms of the negativity bias. So in sum, those are the two basic reasons for me to look for opportunities as you move through your day to have beneficial experiences. And then when you're having them, get the value of them. Don't leave all that money lying on the table. Don't waste them on your brain. Stay with them a few breaths, feel them in your body, and track what's rewarding about them.
Excellent. There's a language issue that I think I want to be clear about, and it's terms like good and bad, positive and negative. Is this suggesting that there are aspects of experience that are just, deleterious or wrong or bad? And is there some sort of spectrum between right experience and wrong experience? Can you just talk about what you mean when you say positive, negative, good, bad experiences?
It's critically important. Again, you're zeroing in on a really important point. So two key points about it. First point, I'm using the words positive and negative, good and bad, synonymously in a pragmatic way, as positive or good is that which promotes happiness and welfare for ourselves and usually for others as well. So, for example, I think it's good to feed children.
Yeah.
I think it's bad to abuse them. I have no problems using those words. So that's how I mean them. I'm not meaning it moralistically. I'm meaning it pragmatically, even though pragmatically leads to morality. Pragmatics lead to morality. Second point, as a Buddhist kind of guy, this question comes up routinely. Is it not dualistic to make distinctions between good and bad? I think, yes, so what? It is dualistic to distinguish between the cup and the coffee in the cup, all right? It's useful to notice whether there's actually coffee in the cup. There is, in fact, versus no coffee, I better get some, right? That's a useful distinction to make. And it's also true at the ultimate level, there's only allness. There are local patternings of the one underlying fabric of reality. Those patternings, including the patterning that is you, James, distinct from the patterning that is me, the patterning that is this body, distinct from these earbuds, the patterning of a feeling of sadness, distinct from a feeling of happiness. They are differentiated meaningfully in ways that matter to us, even as the truth is, as a friend of mine titles his recent book, all our waves are water. The underlying nature of all these patternings is one fabric of reality, which for me is also related in some actual ways to a meaningfully distinct transcendental, a divine. So, and then the last thing I'll say is that just because an experience is bad, so let's say a person is feeling stressed or anxious, or they're self-critical, or they're ruminating about a resentment, some grievance they have, I would call that a negative experience. I would say that that's bad in the sense that it leads to suffering and it leads to harm. It's unpleasant to experience, and it wears down the body, and it often creates trouble in our relationships with others, right? That doesn't mean that we should fight that kind of experience, go to war with it, or try to deny that it exists. It's here. The question for me skillfully is, what do we do now?
And that is actually, that's kind of a part of my next question, though. I do first want to, express appreciation for your, like, so what if it's dualistic? Because I appreciate this sort of pragmatic approach to still accepting that most people aren't 100% dedicating themselves to embracing the transpersonal, the transcendental, and you can be great at transcendental and absolutely shitty at real human relationships if you don't practice the qualities of, to use these terms, the goodness and good behavior inside of the dualism between all these different patterns interacting with each other. So I really appreciated you making that point. The part that goes into my next question about what do we do is that when we're thinking about cultivating happiness, cultivating positive experiences, and looking at it from this dualistic way, like negative experience, positive experience makes sense. I don't really like that experience. It's harmful. It's uncomfortable, etc. And this feels good. This feels nourishing. This is positive for me. That there's maybe this tendency to want to really focus a lot on the positive experiences, but then where do you draw the line between utilizing this type of practice to rationalize or justify emotional repression, basically? And where is the balance between giving our dark emotions space to be and transpire without inappropriately deepening them or dissociating from them?
James, so right on. Absolutely true. It's an incredibly important question and a very, very real one. And so I'll try to learn here and now to disrupt my tendency to move into professor mode and just hit the play button and rattle on. So I'll try to keep it short and sweet. In summary for me, there are fundamentally 4 ways to relate to experience. The first 3 are inside the natural frame, and that's where most people are going to work. The 4th way is to transcend experience. But inside the natural frame, we're having an experience. So let's say in the moment, you're right now really angry at somebody. You feel hurt by them, and you notice that you're just dwelling in it. Okay, let's start there. What do you do? Well, or alternately, let's say you're having a moment where you feel really loved. You feel cared about, you feel connected, you got your friend, you're hanging out, you're laughing, it feels good. Right, what do you do? The first great way to relate to experience, to engage your mind skillfully, is simply to be with what's there. Witness it, observe it, perhaps investigate it, maybe deconstruct it, as the Buddha and others have taught, to kind of feel into the different aspects of it, of the experience, kind of like deconstructing a piece of music to hear the different instruments in it. You could also sense down to what's younger, more vulnerable, more fundamental. All of that's fine. In the process of that, the experience may change. The anger at the friend may change. The anger at the other person might change. The sense of grievance might change, but you're not deliberately trying to nudge it. I consider this way of relating to experience, this stance with regard to it, or a way to practice with it, to be the most fundamental. It's our last resort, because sometimes that's all we can do. And as practice matures, and I can say this for myself as someone who's been doing, in effect, positive neuroplasticity for a long time, more and more, you're just kind of hanging out in what's called choiceless awareness in the Theravadan tradition of Buddhism, my kind of home tradition. You're just sort of hanging out in choiceless awareness at the front edge of now with just whatever is, recognizing its radical transience and replacement endlessly with the next thing without attachment. Great, right? Mm-hmm. Great. Mm-hmm. Being with experience, fantastic. But that's not the only way to practice with the mind. And I think many people, particularly as the Eastern traditions came from the West, have overvalued that stance of bare witnessing, of simply abiding, simply being. In part, I think it's overvalued because the truth is the brain is slow to change. And the negative tendencies, the hindrances that are in the mind, the afflictions, the poisons sometimes they're called, our bad habits, our old fears, our sense of shame, our shrinking away from a challenge, all of that is embedded in the hardware, which is physical and doesn't tend to change unless it's budged, unless it's nudged. And also, we have the negativity bias that's designed to hold on to those physical patterns, those physical traces left behind in the nervous system. So that then, to finish, takes us into the two other ways to practice with the mind, where we work with it, distinct from being with it. And so we work with it by, second, releasing what's negative, what's painful, what's problematic, what's harmful to ourselves and others, preventing it arising in the first place, or sometimes just simply reducing it, helping it decrease. Third, we grow the good. We try to cultivate resilience, mindfulness, happiness, commitment to social justice, commitment to exercise, commitment to sobriety, whatever it is, we're trying to develop that. So those are the three great ways to engage the mind, summarized as let be, let go, let in. Or if you imagine the mind as a garden, witnessing a garden or pulling weeds or planting flowers, all are really important. So for me, when I talk about cultivation, positive neuroplasticity, which is the growing of flowers, the development, the acquisition over time of beneficial, wholesome, enjoyable states of being, I'm doing so in the context of those other two ways to relate to the mind. And then the question becomes what's skillful. And then I think a lot, it really depends. If I'm feeling something painful and difficult, I want to be able to bear that pain. But often I need to resource myself to bear that pain. So I need to draw on resources that I've cultivated to be able to stay with the pain. Or I want to be able to feel into what's deeper than the pains. For example, as my father several years ago was going through the last months of his life, and I was spending a lot of time with him and in the medical centers that he was involved with, my heart was very heavy. And yet it felt that heavy heart was kind of floating in a sea of well-being. Right? And that can make all the difference in the world. I think sometimes what happens is that we're with something negative, we extract all the possible learning that is to be had from it. Like, why am I carrying this grudge at this person? What do I need to feel more deeply to come to a release? Like maybe I need to feel the hurt that's under the anger, or maybe I need to feel the old stuff coming up from junior high school, middle school and high school about being rejected and mistreated by other people that's getting stirred up. Maybe I really need to feel this. Also, maybe to move on, I need to just sort of get that carrying this grudge hurts me more than him. The line is, resentment is like taking poison and waiting for others to die. And then I say to myself, Rick, enough already. There's a Tibetan teacher, Soknyi Rinpoche, has this line, think the same thought again and again. That's fine. But 10 is enough. Right. At some point it feels like enough. And then you go, what? And you move on, and then what's really useful as well, after you've released what's problematic and negative, to try to replace it with something that's a matched alternative, like replacing resentment with the recognition that most of your life is still perfectly intact, even though that other person was a real dick. Yeah. Not related to you, or replace, let's say that, the pain, the hurt of what happened to you was self-compassion for yourself. or replace it with a feeling that other people, at least, are true friends and will not betray you in that way. Okay, that's it. That's my sum.
And so this is the kind of stuff that you talk about in your new book, Resiliency, right? Is it Resiliency or Resilience?
Resilient. It's kind of the end state. There are a lot of books on resilience, but I want to talk about becoming resilient, which is based on growing these underlying muscles. And and that material, by the way, I should add, that new book, Resilient, it's just great. I really have fallen in love with the book. It's my 5th book, and it's a summary of so much that I know. Kind of, I'm mature. I'm toward the end of my career as a therapist and a teacher, and my own journey in human potential. And I really wanted to summarize what I knew and offer to people. And it's based on this great online program I have called the Foundations of Wellbeing, which is an experiential way to engage the material in the book. And I recommend that people check that out too.
I'll make sure there's a link to that in the show notes to this episode. Also, taking a step back just to make it really clear about the question on how to be with the negative, like basically how to differentiate between like not deepening the negative and not dissociating from it, and the role of neuroplasticity or positive neuroplasticity is we're not trying to prevent the negative by overgrowing the positive so much as we're increasing our capacity to work with uncomfortable experiences while maintaining a capacity to be with positive experiences. Does that sound about right?
I would say it's half the truth.
Okay.
The half, in a sense, it is totally right that we're trying to, we are trying to, if one wants to, one can increase the capacity to bear difficult experiences without being overwhelmed by them. And that, if you will, is the key to resilience, because shit will happen.
Right.
Feelings will happen. Buses will be late. Old material will arise from your childhood. Stuff is going to happen. People will be challenging. How do we manage that? How do we ride the waves of life without drowning? That's the essence of resilience, the necessary foundation of any lasting well-being in a changing world. So that's really true. So we want to grow our muscles to be able to deal with that stuff. We also want to grow our psychological resources, our muscles, not just to recover from trauma or loss or deal with adversity, but to keep pursuing our goals moment to moment to moment, just in real life. Little setbacks. People don't respond to an email. There's a disappointment. You got to figure out a problem. Your computer printer won't work. People are people. You got to keep going through that stuff. And resilience fundamentally is what helps us keep on going. So we need that. And as part of that, we need to be able to feel our feelings, to deal with thoughts and feelings passing through the mind without being, as the Buddha put it, without them invading us and remaining. That's the key distinction. Stuff will arise, stuff will pass through, kind of like birds or clouds passing through the sky of awareness. But awareness abides. Pema Chodron has a very nice line. You are the sky. Everything else is the weather. All right? On the one hand. But on the other hand, we also want to cultivate happiness as a trait, right? Or let me say it like this. It's useful, and I think perfectly all right, and in fact moral, to cultivate well-being as a trait. An underlying sense in the core of your being of happiness, love, and peace. That's how I operationalize well-being in a deep sense. It's perfectly desirable to do that. Why not? Why not, in addition to cultivating our capacity to deal with the bad, why not cultivate the good? And much as in a garden, flowers crowd out weeds. As people develop more and more of this kind of underlying unconditional well-being that's increasingly baked into you, embedded in you, you take it with you wherever you go, even as you face challenges, it's less and less contingent on what's happening around you. And frankly, over time, it's not contingent on substances we're taking or what we're doing with our physiology. We're already there. And I work backwards to finish from, I think about reverse engineering enlightenment. How do you reverse engineer enlightenment? How do you think about what's going on in the brain of a Buddha or someone who's really evolved Or how do you help? Let's say you enter some kind of exalted state through a psychedelic. I have. How do you help that land and last and become part of you in everyday life? Or, how do you actually do that? And to me, the essence of it all, whatever might be true about the divine, the transcendental, in the material plane, is to help our experiences leave lasting beneficial traces behind. And that matter is under our nose all the time. And one of the most extraordinary things is that we routinely forget it. We routinely don't help our experiences to sink in and help us become better people, wiser people, more loving people, more tougher people along the way.
Great. Well, that kind of dials into one of the questions I have here, which is specifically about mindfulness meditation and the benefits that you see in that. And I'm having like a crowding, like multiple questions all at once, and the only thing that's coming out is just I
just want to acknowledge I failed at my intention to not drop into professor mode there. So
that's
try to be better.
We're good. We are. This is the positive right now. So, the multiple questions are basically, what are the benefits of mindfulness meditation, which is a two-part question, one of which is like on the practicalities of living, and the other of which is insofar as what deep mindfulness meditation reinforces in the brain in the sense of self to experience the self as. Those are like, that's the question. I'm not sure. This is terrible interviewership that I'm doing right now because I'm working myself out talking with you. And then the other question is about the dangers of mindfulness meditation, because I've heard you say in other places that, and quote, opening to our experience can be like opening a trapdoor to hell, end quote.
Yeah.
So I don't know how you want to tackle, like maybe we could talk about the benefits of mindfulness meditation and the possible dangers of it, and save the larger metaphysical question to go afterwards, because I really want to give that one some extra space as well.
Okay. So this is great stuff. It'll be a good discipline for me to be more focused. So first, what is mindfulness? People use that word in different ways. I use it in the traditional sense of sustained present moment awareness. Simply that. That sustained present moment awareness can be applied internally as well as externally. And it can be kind of focused tightly in, like a laser, on some specific stimulus, some specific state of being in a state of concentration, including deep meditative absorption, a samadhi state. Or that field of mindful awareness, present moment awareness, can be expanded out as widely as possible, the widest possible aperture to include everything continuously at the front edge of now. Right?
Okay.
That's mindfulness. Alongside mindfulness can be other things like wise intentions or self-compassion or metacognitive attention to attention that helps us sustain mindfulness. Sometimes people describe mindfulness as only radically passive witnessing, so that any form of wise effort inside your own mind is presumed to be in conflict with mindfulness. That is a mistake. That is an error that has crept in to the Western understanding of mindfulness, and it's not present in the ancient traditions in which mindfulness arose, and it doesn't make any sense because we can be mindful while simultaneously arguing with our wife and trying to do it in as skillful a way as possible and noticing when we fail. Right. Stuff can be alongside mindfulness. You can be mindful of the desire to get hammered yet again tonight with with alongside that mindfulness of your own tendencies to have another little voice inside go, that's the addict talking. Be careful. Don't do that. A little bit of that goes a long way, etc. So, okay. Now, mindfulness meditation. There are many forms of meditation. I think to meditate inherently, we have to be somewhat mindful. Otherwise, we're just completely lost in thought. And that might be beneficial for some reason, but it's not what I'd call meditation. Right. So classically, mindfulness meditation these days is spoken of in a secular way, as not a form of prayer. It's interesting to appreciate that most people who are doing something contemplative and meditative around the world, the majority of the people who are doing that today will do it in a religious framework, in the context of some prayerful or some sense of relationship to something that's meaningful to them, that's transcendental. Mindfulness meditation can include that if you want to, but it doesn't presume any kind of theistic involvement. It's agnostic. Okay, if not atheistic. All right, so mindfulness meditation typically takes the form grounded in the sometimes called Vipassana or Theravadan tradition, in which we simply abide in the present with some sense of an object of attention that helps us stay present, like the sensations of breathing. We can use other things. And then otherwise, we just kind of hang out on the banks of the stream of consciousness, watching it all go by. We try to stay present on the banks, observing the stream of consciousness. Routinely, we get caught by it and swept along. And then as soon as we notice we've been swept along into some little inner mini movie, we then try to bring ourselves back again and again and again. And over time, and I can report that's been true in my own case, I started meditating in 1974. More and more, you just are able to sustain being dropped in most seconds of the 10 or 20 or 45 minutes you're meditating. Okay, so mindfulness meditation. Now, benefits of mindfulness meditation. There's an enormous amount of research at this point on mindfulness meditation and more generally mindfulness training. The research is showing that on average, again, there are exceptions to this we'll get to, on average, that form of practice has many, many benefits for physical and mental health. Physically, probably largely through calming down the stress response and training the body to recover faster from upsetting experiences, stressful experiences. People who routinely have this kind of practice have a stronger immune system. They're more able to bounce back from stress. They have a cardiovascular system that's more protected. There's new evidence showing that intensive meditative practice, maybe milder meditative practice as well, protects the telomeres, the caps on the ends of the chromosomes.
Interesting.
And that's important because protecting your telomeres helps you have a longer life and have less age-related illness as you get older. Good stuff. Mentally, mindfulness practices, especially more formal ones like a regular meditation practice, you tend to increase mood, decrease anxiety, increase resilience, increase positive emotions, and tend to also increase compassion for yourself and for others. Really, really good things.
Yeah, good stuff.
Good stuff. There's evidence as well that frequent meditative practice changes your brain for the better, typically by strengthening neural tissues in the executive control regions in the prefrontal cortex behind the forehead, because you're regulating attention again and again. Also, regular meditative training tends to reduce activity in the alarm bell of the brain, the amygdala. So people are still able to track the bus that's racing toward them, but they don't tend to brood about negative stuff so much. And regular meditative practice also tends to increase a tissue in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which puts things in perspective and regulates the amygdala. So the hippocampus tells the amygdala, it's okay, sweetie, calm down. That on the 0 to 10 yuck scale, that was just a 2. No need to freak out like it's a 7.
Right.
That's hippocampus in part, kind of essentially doing that. So there are other known effects of long-term contemplative practice, but I'll just kind of stop right there.
Yeah.
All that said, to your point about the trapdoor to hell, it is true that if a person is really vulnerable to being flooded by overwhelming negative material, typically because they've had some kind of trauma history, not always. If a person is really vulnerable in that way, just simply being open to your experience can be very painful and upsetting. So the first thing to do is to build up inner resources like what's called distress tolerance in psychology, being able to tolerate painful experiences without being overwhelmed by them, being able to disidentify from those painful experiences and witness them as if you're watching a movie from 20 rows back. Mm-hmm. It's a scary movie. It's upsetting, but you're distanced from it. That's a capacity to build up, or to build up the capacity, the felt sense that others are with you who love you. You have allies inside you. I call it your caring committee. Multiple characters, including fictional characters like Gandalf and the fairy godmother,
sure, yeah.
Sleeping Beauty. That they're with you. These are resources to build up to tolerate mindfulness. Right? So that's good for a person in general, and in particular, if a person is heading into an intensive immersion in mindfulness, like a 10-day silent retreat, and that person has a big history of trauma, tends toward dissociation, is very, very permeable to experience and very prone to being flooded by it, well, that person maybe should not go on that retreat yet. Maybe that person should practice meditating at home first with their cat curled up in their lap. I did a lot of catitation with our cat in my lap for a long time. Maybe that person should do a one-day workshop and see how it goes before really jumping into the deep end of the pool. And to finish here, it is true that a small fraction of people are vulnerable to significantly negative experiences when they practice mindfulness, especially if they do it in an extremely intense way, like a 10-day retreat. That's true. And people like that should be careful, and teachers like myself should be thoughtful and supportive of people, who have that vulnerability. But that vulnerability applies to a very small fraction of the great majority of people, of the population, the great majority of which will be very, very benefited by mindfulness in general and mindfulness meditation in particular. And sometimes there's attention to the handful of people who are harmed by a meditation retreat or by mindfulness practice. And then there's a kind of, in the media, a sensationalistic overgeneralization of it to everybody. And that's an error. Most people will do just fine increasing their mindfulness and picking up some kind of regular meditation practice.
Excellent. So we are 3 minutes to your max 1 hour. Do you have any extra?
Let's keep going a little bit longer.
Okay. So
I started late.
Okay. So let's get into this, what was like the third part of my bottlenecked question about what the practice of meditation, sitting on the edge of now, I think that was the way that you described it. What do you see that doing to the sense of self? Like, what is that reinforcing in perception and experience? Metaphysically, like the big question.
Well, there are different layers to that big question, of course, as usual with you. But this is great. All right, so let's see here. First, a general finding about the results of regular meditative practice is that a person's sense of self tends to shift, and in fact, their relationship to the sense of self tends to shift. In other words, instead of the conventional notion, especially in the West, Western philosophy, Western psychology, distinct from the East, there's this presumption that inside each one of us, notice the words here, is a being, an entity of some kind that has three fundamental characteristics. One, that entity is unified. There's just one self. Second, that entity is enduring. The self we are today is the self we were yesterday and 30 years ago or 10 years ago. Third, that this self in some ways is independent of causal influence, that things happen to it, but it itself is in some meaningful sense independent. It has an independent existence of some kind, right? Those are the ordinary presumptions of self. Those are the constituting attributes of the presumed Western self. In meditation, what starts to happen is you start to observe again and again and again that those constituting conditions or attributes aren't real in your own experience. You start to observe, first of all, that the apparent I is multiple and compounded. There are many apparent I's, depending on the time of day. The I who sets the alarm for exercise at night is not the same I who wakes up early in the morning and says, who set the damn alarm so early, right? Second, so you start realizing that the apparent self is made up of many parts. Second, you start to recognize that it is continually changing. It's not enduring in some permanent kind of sense. And the third thing you start to recognize is that that process of change in the compounded elements of the self is dependent upon other conditions. Immediate stimuli, what's happening to you from the outside in, also stimuli bubbling up from the inside out. And in a fundamental sense, this apparent independent entity, the I inside, is actually, again, a local expression of a vast tapestry of causes upon which it rises dependently. That starts to shift as you do meditative practice, or to put it a little differently, you start taking life less personally. And over time, you get less and less identified with your own I, your own sense of self, and less caught up in your own story. You start being able to observe the stream of consciousness in a more detached and impersonal way. You are a person. Persons are real. Persons absolutely do exist. You're a person, I'm a person, your body exists, I believe, my body exists. There are a collection of tendencies and experiences and history and responsibilities and rights that that I won't say belong to, but are associated with in an enduring way with the particular persons we are. That's really clear. But in terms of your experience, more and more as you abide as awareness of content passing through the mind, and as you recognize that awareness itself arises dependently upon a body that has a nervous system and is capable of awareness, embedded in nature and life and through 3.5 billion years of evolution and 13.8 billion years or so, give or take, of the universe altogether, you just more and more you relax, you lighten up, you focus more on the light shining through the tiles in the mosaic of the apparent self. So that's a shift over time that's very real.
So that said, what does that type of experience for you, how does that contribute to a greater understanding of the nature of life and the reality itself? Like experiences pushing even beyond that, and then all of a sudden, to sort of paraphrase Peter Sage, your life is now being lived by something greater, or we experience ourselves as life itself. No differentiation, no disconnection. These types of fully transpersonal type experiences are available in a meditative practice. For you, how has that contributed to what you see as the scope and the structure of time and reality and the self?
Right.
In 2 minutes or less.
No worries. Piece of cake. So, as usual, phenomenally interesting, apt question. So there are two ways to get at that question, I think, from the so-called third-person perspective and from the first-person perspective. And I just find it easier to get at initially from the third-person perspective, because from the first-person perspective, the words start to blur and it's hard to know what you really mean. So to me, so I want to be really clear here. So well, I'll say it like this. The short answer for me is that as we have increasingly these, I will say, less self or not self experiences, where more and more we start relating to experience. So I'm going to answer this first from a first-person perspective. As we start relating to experience increasingly in this more interdependently arising, impersonal, compounded way, we start relating to our experience, and we start experiencing life increasingly in a sense of interdependent arising with all the various vast networks of causes around us that coalesce moment after moment after moment as both this moment of materiality in this particular body and this moment of mentality in the experience that's occurring, what's happening in awareness in the moment. As that happens, you're right, the sense of I and the problems that travel with I, the sense of possessiveness or righteousness or defensiveness or identification with various things increasingly falls away. And that, for most people, particularly if you've trained and you're resourced a little bit, so it's not self-alienating in a sense. It's not a frightening experience. You get more used to it. You become more and more comfortable with it. And I can report for myself, it just feels great. You get so kind of tired of I, the inner narrator, the point of view, the me, my precious, it's great.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, that was first person. Now, third person. The question is, from a third person perspective, I've reported, much as I think you report and other people report, who are on the path that we're talking about here, with or without psychedelics, right? Mm-hmm. Or with and without psychedelics, let's say, in my case. Well, what does that actually mean? And then we go to levels of explanation from a third-person perspective, or you could call it categories of causes. The first presumed, so if you think of it, we start with experience. Cogito ergo sum. I experience, therefore, there must be an experience. There must be a basis for experience, right? So in other words, we start with our thoughts, our feelings, the virtual reality of phenomenology, from which we infer materiality. We can't prove it. Ultimately, you can't prove it. It could all be a dream. I go, so what? That's a boring, to me, inquiry, because I get it. I get radical idealism in philosophy. I get it. At the end of the day, to me, most likely, our experiences, much like the experiences of a monkey or a cat or a lizard, perhaps even a spider, are based upon underlying material processes, such that experience is a natural phenomenon, much as lightning or the change of the seasons. And much as people have come to understand that lightning is not due to Jupiter hurling thunderbolts, but is due to natural causes. And people understand that the change of the seasons or the differentiation of different species of plants and animals, and now bacteria, is due to evolution, not due to God just creating everything in the Garden of Eden once, 8,000 years ago. As people get that those phenomena have natural explanations, natural causes. That's the so-called natural frame. It includes all kinds of crazy stuff. Quantum entanglement, dark energy, trippy stuff.
Yeah.
But it's presumed to be natural. There's no need to resort to ghosts or God to explain the sun rising in the morning and setting at night. It's due to the rotation of this big ball, planet Earth. Okay? Mm-hmm. So the question then becomes, as people do psycho-spiritual practice, with or without the aid of various substances of any kind, including antidepressants, whatever, right? As people do practices, as people train, as people live, including as people have extraordinary experiences, do we need to resort to anything other than entirely natural explanations for the results? do we need to resort to the supernatural or the transcendental to explain some of what's happening? It's a key distinction. You see that, and it's critically important. And I see routinely, I got into this stuff in like 1969. You know, just think about the 60s, the 70s, all this stuff.
It's radical.
Here we are today, you know?
Yeah.
What a long, strange trip it's been, right? I think people blur these distinctions all the time, mistakenly and sometimes foolishly, because they're critically important. Just because a person feels one with everything doesn't necessarily mean that God's involved, right? And so you're following what I'm saying, right?
I'm listening to you. Yeah. I appreciate your case for naturalism in this regards.
All right, great.
Yeah.
So then the question, so good. So you just cut right to the chase here. That's great. So then the question for me becomes really quite directly, was there something supernatural in the mix when I had that extraordinary experience on psychedelics or on the 8th day of a meditation retreat? Was there something outside that's meaningfully distinct from the natural frame? And in my experience, and then, or even more ultimately, was the divine involved? And I distinguish between reincarnation, extrasensory perception, discarnate entities. I distinguish that from the ultimate divine, the transcendental. For me, those are meaningfully distinct in principle categories. So at the end of it all, I would just say for myself, that I have had experiences, and also on reflection, I believe that there are supernatural factors that are meaningfully distinct from the natural frame, and that ultimately as well, there is an underlying divine, transcendental, that's meaningfully distinct from both the natural and the supernatural. And I could talk about the characteristics of the transcendental, and we could talk about that in my own view. And for myself, a lot. I'm cool with being lived by life. I'm really into that. I'm into allness, nowness, wholeness. I'm going to lead a meditation retreat this summer at Shambhala Mountain Center, where I'm going to work through 7 progressions of neurodharma that are very informed by the most, to me, radical teachings in Buddhism and other traditions, especially Buddhism, but are also deeply informed by the natural, by understanding our neuropsychology. But the 7th step is to edge into the transcendental. And so for me, I'm interested in more than being lived by the natural. I'm interested in increasingly being lived by the transcendental, the divine, and become increased. So I do practices in the natural for the benefits inside the natural frame, and also to help myself become more accessible to and transparent to the already always present transcendental.
Beautiful. Thank you for going deep on that big question, Rick. Our time is well over, so maybe just to end the interview, you can offer, we can bring it way back down into the world of dualism, and you can offer the listeners what you would say is like the one most important, actionable piece of advice for starting to apply the potentials of positive neuroplasticity in their lives towards a greater sense of happiness, resiliency, and well-being.
It's great. I would say many times a day, take in the good. Slow down, show up for it, receive it, be intimate with it in your own experience, let it land inside you, and let it help you, and let it shape you for the better. As you decide, as you define what is better. And that's what I would suggest to people every day. There's a sweet little saying in Tibet, sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, sudden awakening, gradual cultivation, on and on and on. And this process of gradual cultivation can lead to sudden awakening, which then can become the next thing to internalize and take in.
Beautiful. Rick, thank you very much for your time today. I'll get all your social media handles through email later, not to take up any more of your time, and include them in the outro to this episode. So thank you very much for your time.
James, honestly, this was really excellent. You're a trip.
Thanks, Rick.
I really was. I wish you well. And it's great what you're doing. Keep doing it. It's great.
Cheers. I feel the same way about you, man. Thanks.
Thank you, man. Take it easy then.
Bye. Well, so concludes another episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Don't tune out just yet. Hang around with me for a minute, because I would like to extend a super thanks to my patrons on Patreon who make this show possible, and invite you, if you are not yet a patron, to head over to patreon.com/James W. Jesso to start supporting Jesus Christ, to start supporting the show, as it is very, very supportive to my commitment here to producing this content for you, as well as my written work. I mention my writing work a lot, but not a lot is really coming out recently, and that's because I am like up to my nipples in this essay I've been writing for 5 months about bad trips and psychosis, and like the inadequacy complex is so huge, and I'm trying, and it's just like I'm really struggling with it, but it's getting close. So there is writing work happening constantly, although on the surface it might appear that I am not releasing very much content written wise, because, well, you know, I'm not writing a bunch of short, reasonably shallow articles. I'm working on very thoroughly in-depth long-form content for you. Anyways, becoming a patron, that would be super awesome. Patreon.com/James W. Jesso, as well as leaving me a donation on PayPal or through cryptocurrencies. Other ways to support the show include buying a copy of one of my books, Decomposing the Shadow or The True Light of Darkness, which are about my psychological and philosophical theories for working with psilocybin mushrooms as a spiritual agent and an agent of self-facilitated emotional and psychological healing. You can find those on Amazon or at jameswjesso.com/books, or in the link contained in the description to this episode. Thank you for listening to Adventures Through the Mind. My name is James W. Jesso. I will see you on the next episode. Bye.